The sound of the slap echoed through the grand dining room like a gunshot. Emma's cheek burned as she stumbled backward, knocking over a crystal wine glass that shattered against the marble floor. The entire Thompson family sat frozen around the mahogany table, their Christmas dinner forgotten as Margaret Thompson stood over her daughter-in-law with pure hatred blazing in her eyes. "How dare you speak to me like that in my own home?" Margaret hissed, her perfectly manicured hand still raised. "You're nothing but trailer trash who got lucky, and you'll never be good enough for this family." Emma touched her stinging cheek, tasting blood where her teeth had cut her lip. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Around the table, David's siblings and their spouses looked anywhere but at her, their silence more painful than the slap itself. Even David, her husband of 3 years, sat motionless with his head down, too much of a coward to defend the woman he claimed to love. That was the moment Emma knew her marriage was over. That was the moment everything changed. Emma Rodriguez had never imagined she'd end up married into the Thompson dynasty. Growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment above her grandmother's bakery in East Cleveland, she'd learned early that people like the Thompsons existed in a different universe entirely. While she was helping her grandmother knead dough at 5 in the morning before school, families like theirs were probably having their breakfast served on silver platters by uniformed staff. She met David Thompson purely by accident on a rainy Thursday evening in downtown Chicago. Emma had been rushing home from her job as a social worker, her umbrella broken and her hair soaked, when she literally ran into him outside the Starbucks on Michigan Avenue. He was stepping out of a black town car, checking his expensive watch, when Emma's wet shoes slipped on the sidewalk and she crashed right into his chest. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she gasped, trying to steady herself while her wet files scattered across the sidewalk. David could have easily brushed her off, called his driver, and disappeared into his privileged world. Instead, he knelt down in his $1,000 suit and helped her gather her soggy paperwork. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and Emma was struck by how genuine his concern sounded. Most wealthy men she'd encountered through her work were either condescending or completely indifferent to people like her, but David Thompson looked at her like she actually mattered. "Just my pride," Emma replied, trying to laugh off her embarrassment, "and possibly my job if these case files are ruined." David insisted on buying her coffee and a new umbrella, and somehow that coffee turned into dinner the next week. Emma learned that David was different from what she'd expected. He asked about her work with at-risk youth, listened intently when she talked about the kids she was trying to help, and seemed genuinely interested in her world. He didn't name-drop or flash his wealth around like she'd seen other rich men do. He was kind, funny, and surprisingly down-to-earth for someone who'd grown up with every privilege imaginable. For the first 6 months of their relationship, Emma felt like she was living in a fairy tale. David would pick her up after work in his regular sedan, not one of the family's flashy cars. They'd go to neighborhood restaurants, catch movies at the local theater, and spend quiet evenings at her small apartment, talking about everything and nothing. He seemed to prefer her simple life to his complicated one, often saying that being with her was the only time he felt like himself. Emma should have known it was too good to last. The first crack appeared when David finally introduced her to his family at a charity gala, 6 months into their relationship. Margaret Thompson took one look at Emma's department store dress and discount jewelry, and her expression turned arctic. She spent the entire evening either ignoring Emma completely or making subtle digs about her background, her education, and her quaint little job. "So Emma," Margaret had said with a smile that never reached her eyes, "David tells me you work with troubled children. How charitable of you to spend time with people from your own background." The insult was wrapped in politeness, but Emma felt its sting nonetheless. David's father, Robert Thompson, was more polite but equally dismissive, treating Emma like she was invisible. David's siblings, Patricia and Jonathan, followed their parents' lead, making small talk that felt more like interrogation than conversation. After that first meeting, David started making excuses for why Emma couldn't attend family events. "They need time to warm up to you," he'd say, "or it's just going to be boring business talk anyway." Emma told herself she didn't mind, but deep down she knew she was being hidden away like a shameful secret. The real problem started when David proposed. Emma had been expecting it for weeks, had caught him acting nervous and secretive, and when he got down on one knee in their favorite restaurant, she said yes without hesitation. She loved him, and she believed he loved her enough to stand up to his family's disapproval. She was wrong. The engagement announcement in the Chicago Tribune's society pages was a masterclass in passive aggression. Instead of a warm welcome to the family, the brief mention read like an obituary. David Thompson, son of prominent businessman Robert Thompson, announces his engagement to Emma Rodriguez, a local social worker. No mention of her education, her achievements, or anything that might suggest she was worthy of joining their family. Margaret Thompson's reaction was swift and brutal. She immediately began planning a wedding that had nothing to do with what Emma wanted, and everything to do with maintaining the family's image. When Emma suggested having the ceremony at the small Catholic church where she'd been baptized, Margaret laughed in her face. "Absolutely not," Margaret declared during what was supposed to be a collaborative planning session. "The Thompsons have been married at Trinity Episcopal for 4 generations. We're not breaking tradition for your little neighborhood chapel. Every decision became a battle. Margaret wanted 500 guests, Emma wanted 50. Margaret insisted on a full orchestra, Emma wanted her cousin's band. Margaret hired the most expensive caterer in the city. Emma suggested her grandmother's bakery could handle the desserts. Each time Emma tried to incorporate something meaningful from her own life, Margaret shot it down with increasing hostility. This isn't about you, Margaret finally snapped during one particularly heated discussion about flowers. This is about the Thompson family reputation. David is marrying beneath himself, and the least we can do is make sure the wedding doesn't advertise that fact to everyone we know. David, caught between his mother and his fiancée, chose the path of least resistance every single time. Just let her have this one, he'd whisper to Emma when she tried to fight back. It's easier than arguing with her, and in the end we'll be married either way. But Emma was beginning to realize that marriage was supposed to be about more than just the wedding day. If David wouldn't stand up for her now, when would he ever? The wedding itself was a beautiful disaster. Margaret had created the perfect Thompson family event, complete with crystal chandeliers, imported flowers, and a guest list that read like a who's who of Chicago society. Emma felt like a stranger at her own wedding, wearing a dress she didn't choose, walking down an aisle in a church she'd never attended, toward a future that felt less like a dream and more like a gilded cage. Her family looked lost among the sea of designer gowns and expensive suits. Her grandmother, tiny and proud in her best dress, sat in the front row next to Margaret Thompson, who looked like she was attending a funeral rather than a wedding. Emma's cousins, teachers and nurses and small business owners seemed to shrink under the judgmental stares of David's relatives. The reception was even worse. Margaret had seated Emma's family at tables in the back, as far from the head table as possible. When Emma's uncle Carlos asked David about his work, Margaret quickly steered the conversation elsewhere, as if Emma's family wasn't worthy of engaging with the groom. Emma watched her loved ones being systematically excluded from what should have been a celebration of two families coming together. The honeymoon provided a brief respite from the family drama, but reality came crashing back as soon as they returned to Chicago. David had bought them a beautiful condo in Lincoln Park, and Emma had been excited to create their first home together. But Margaret had other ideas. "I've taken the liberty of hiring an interior designer," Margaret announced during their first dinner back. "Someone who understands how a Thompson home should look. I know you mean well, Emma, but you simply don't have the background to furnish a home in this neighborhood properly." Emma stared at Margaret in disbelief. "Excuse me? It's our home. I think I can handle picking out furniture." Margaret's laugh was like ice cracking. "Oh, my dear girl, you really don't understand how this works, do you? David is a Thompson. That means his home reflects on all of us. We can't have you decorating like you're still living above a bakery." The decorator Margaret hired stripped away every trace of Emma's personality and replaced it with cold, expensive perfection. The photographs of Emma's family were replaced with formal Thompson portraits. Her grandmother's quilt, a wedding gift lovingly made by hand, was deemed inappropriate for the living room and banished to a closet. Even her books, carefully collected over years of saving, were replaced with leather-bound volumes that no one would ever read but looked impressive on the shelves. Emma felt like she was disappearing, one piece at a time. Work became her refuge. At the community center where she counseled teenage mothers and kids aging out of foster care, she could still be herself. She could make a difference in lives that mattered. But even this sanctuary wasn't safe from Margaret's interference. "When are you going to quit that little job?" Margaret asked during one of their mandatory weekly lunches. "It's not appropriate for a Thompson wife to be working in such unsavory conditions. People talk, Emma. They wonder why my son's wife needs to work at all, and in such a place." Emma's temper finally flared. "That little job helps kids who have nowhere else to turn. I'm not quitting because you're embarrassed by what I do for a living." Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You'll do as you're told if you want to remain part of this family. David may have been foolish enough to marry you, but that doesn't mean you get to drag our reputation through the mud with your bleeding heart crusade." That night Emma begged David to support her. "She wants me to quit my job," she told him as they got ready for bed. "She thinks helping kids makes your family look bad." David sighed, loosening his tie with the weary air of a man who'd had this conversation too many times. "Maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing," he said quietly. "You could volunteer somewhere more suitable. The Children's Hospital Foundation maybe, or the Art Museum, places where the other wives volunteer." Emma stared at her husband in horror. "Are you serious right now? You want me to quit helping kids who actually need me so I can play dress up with your mother's friends?" "It's not about that," David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's about fitting in, about being part of the family. Mom's not going anywhere, Emma. She's always going to be part of our lives. Fighting with her just makes everything harder for everyone." But Emma was beginning to understand that there was no fitting in with the Thompson family. To them she would always be the girl from the wrong side of town who had somehow tricked their golden boy into marriage. No amount of changing herself would ever be enough. The breaking point came at their first Christmas as a married couple. Emma had been looking forward to the holiday, hoping that the spirit of the season might soften Margaret's hostility. She'd been wrong before, but she kept hoping that somewhere underneath all that coldness was a woman who could learn to accept her. Margaret had insisted they spend Christmas Day at the family estate in Lake Forest, a sprawling mansion that looked like something out of a movie.
Emma had carefully chosen gifts for everyone, spending money she couldn't really afford on thoughtful presents that showed how much she wanted to be accepted. For Margaret, she'd found a vintage brooch at an antique shop that reminded her of the one Margaret wore in her wedding photos. For David's father, a first-edition book on Chicago architecture that had taken weeks to track down. For his siblings, carefully selected items that reflected their interests and personalities. The Thompson family gifts, in contrast, felt like weapons disguised as generosity. Margaret presented Emma with a complete makeover package, appointments with a personal shopper, a hairstylist, and a deportment coach who could teach her how to behave in proper society. "I thought it was time we addressed some of your rough edges," Margaret said with a smile that felt like a slap. "After all, you represent all of us now." Emma forced herself to smile and say thank you, even as humiliation burned in her chest. Around the table, David's family exchanged glances that confirmed what she'd always suspected. They saw her as a project to be fixed, not a person to be loved. The final straw came during dinner, when Emma tried to share a story about one of her success stories at work. She'd been working with a 16-year-old named Maria, who'd just gotten her GED despite being a single mother. Emma was proud of Maria's achievement, and thought the family might appreciate hearing about someone overcoming difficult circumstances. Instead, Margaret cut her off mid-sentence. "Must we discuss such depressing topics at Christmas dinner?" she asked with obvious disgust. "Some of us would prefer to enjoy our meal without hearing about teenage pregnancies and broken families." Emma felt her cheeks burn, but she pressed on. "I just thought you might like to hear about someone who's working hard to build a better life for herself and her daughter." Margaret's expression turned venomous. "What I'd like is for my daughter-in-law to show some class and consideration for others. Not everyone wants to hear about your little charity cases during a family celebration." That's when Emma finally snapped. 3 years of subtle insults, deliberate exclusions, and constant criticism had built up inside her like pressure in a volcano, and Margaret's dismissive cruelty toward Maria was the final trigger. "My charity cases?" Emma stood up from the table, her voice shaking with rage. "Those kids have more integrity and courage in their little fingers than this entire family has combined. At least they're fighting for something real instead of sitting around judging people they think are beneath them." The dining room went deadly silent. Even the staff seemed to freeze in place, sensing the explosion that was coming. Margaret rose slowly from her chair, her face white with fury except for 2 bright spots of color on her cheeks. "How dare you," Margaret whispered, her voice deadly quiet. "How dare you come into my home, eat at my table, and insult my family?" "I'm insulting your family." Emma laughed bitterly. "You've done nothing but insult me since the day David brought me home. You've criticized everything about me, from my clothes to my job to my background. You've made it crystal clear that I'll never be good enough for your precious son." Margaret's control finally snapped completely. "You're absolutely right," she snarled. "You're not good enough. You're a nobody from nowhere who got lucky, and you'll never be anything more than that." Emma felt tears of rage burning behind her eyes, but she refused to give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "At least I didn't have to buy my worth with Daddy's money," she shot back. "At least I've actually done something meaningful with my life instead of sitting around spending other people's money and looking down on everyone else." That's when Margaret struck. The slap came so fast, Emma didn't see it coming. One moment she was standing her ground, the next she was stumbling backward as pain exploded across her face. The crystal wine glass went flying, shattering against the marble floor with a sound like breaking dreams. Emma touched her cheek, feeling the heat of the handprint Margaret had left behind. She looked around the table at David's family, searching for even one person who would speak up for her, who would say that what Margaret had done was wrong. But David just sat there with his head in his hands, his silence louder than any words could have been. His father carefully folded his napkin and looked away. His siblings studied their plates like they contained the secrets of the universe. Emma realized in that moment that she was completely alone.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had married into a family that would never accept her, and her own husband didn't have the backbone to defend her even when his mother physically attacked her. "I'm done," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "I'm done pretending this was ever going to work. I'm done trying to become someone I'm not just to please people who will never think I'm good enough anyway." She walked out of that dining room with her head held high, leaving behind the shattered glass, the ruined dinner, and the marriage that had been doomed from the start. Behind her she could hear Margaret's voice, shrill with victory. Good riddance to bad rubbish. But as Emma gathered her coat and purse from the front hall, she had no idea that someone had been watching the entire scene unfold. Someone who had seen everything, and was already planning to make the Thompson family pay for what they had done. The real story was just beginning. Emma drove through the empty Chicago streets with tears streaming down her face, her cheeks still throbbing from Margaret's slap. She had nowhere to go except her grandmother's old apartment, which had been sitting empty since Abuela Rosa passed away 6 months earlier. Emma had kept paying the rent, unable to let go of the only place that had ever truly felt like home. The familiar scent of cinnamon and vanilla still lingered in the small rooms above what used to be Rosa's bakery. Emma collapsed onto the worn sofa where she'd done homework as a child, finally allowing herself to sob for everything she'd lost. Not just her marriage, but her sense of self, her confidence, and 3 years of trying to become someone she wasn't. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from David, each one more desperate than the last. "Emma, please come home. Mom was wrong to hit you. We can work this out." But notably absent was any promise that he would stand up to his mother, or any acknowledgement of how deeply his family had wounded her. Emma turned off her phone and tried to sleep, but morning brought a new nightmare. The doorbell rang at 7 a.m., and she opened it to find a stern-faced man in an expensive suit holding an envelope. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm James Morrison, attorney for the Thompson family. I have papers for you to sign." Emma's hand shook as she read the divorce documents. Margaret had wasted no time. The settlement was insulting, offering Emma barely enough to cover a security deposit on a decent apartment, with a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent her from ever speaking publicly about the Thompson family. "Tell Mrs. Thompson I'll think about it," Emma said, closing the door on the lawyer's protests. But thinking was a luxury Emma couldn't afford. Within hours she discovered just how far Margaret's influence reached. A call to her supervisor at the community center delivered devastating news. The Thompson Foundation, one of their major donors, had suddenly withdrawn their funding, citing philosophical differences with current staff. "I'm sorry, Emma," her supervisor said, his voice heavy with regret. "The board says we have to make cuts, and since you're the newest hire," Emma knew exactly what was happening. Margaret was systematically destroying her life, cutting off every avenue of support, until signing those divorce papers became her only option. The Thompson matriarch had underestimated Emma's stubborn streak, but she hadn't underestimated her power to make Emma's life miserable. Over the next week, the pressure intensified. Emma's landlord received an anonymous tip about suspected illegal activities in the building, prompting an investigation that found nothing but cost Emma days of harassment. Her car loan was mysteriously called in early. Even her gym membership was canceled due to irregularities in payment. Margaret Thompson was methodically dismantling Emma's entire existence, piece by piece. Emma was sitting in the bakery's old kitchen, staring at the unsigned divorce papers and wondering how she'd ever fight someone with Margaret's resources, when she heard footsteps on the stairs leading to her apartment. She assumed it was another lawyer or investigator sent by the Thompsons, but when she opened the door she found herself face to face with a stranger. The man was probably in his early 40s, tall and lean with dark hair that was just beginning to show silver at the temples. His clothes were expensive but understated, and there was something about his presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Most striking were his eyes, a deep blue that seemed to see everything. "Mrs. Thompson, my name is Alexander Kane. I wonder if we could talk." Emma's first instinct was to slam the door. She'd had enough of wealthy men showing up at her doorstep with legal documents and threats, but something in Alexander's expression stopped her. Unlike the cold calculation she'd grown accustomed to seeing in the eyes of the Thompson family's associates, Alexander looked genuinely concerned. "If you're here on behalf of the Thompsons, I'm not interested," Emma said, but she didn't close the door. Alexander smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. "Actually, I'm here because of what the Thompsons did to you. May I come in? I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." Against her better judgment, Emma stepped aside and let him enter. Alexander looked around the small apartment with what seemed like genuine appreciation rather than the barely concealed disgust she'd become used to from David's social circle. "This is a lovely place," he said, running his fingers along the worn wooden table where Emma's grandmother had rolled thousands of empanadas. "It feels like a real home." Emma poured coffee into mismatched mugs, her curiosity overriding her caution. "How do you know what the Thompsons did to me? And who are you really?" Alexander accepted the coffee gratefully, and settled into one of the kitchen chairs as if he belonged there. "I know because I was there that night. Not in the dining room, but close enough to hear everything that happened." Emma's blood ran cold. "You were spying on us?" "Not exactly." Alexander's expression grew serious. "I was there on business with Robert Thompson. We were supposed to have a meeting about a potential acquisition, but when I arrived the staff told me the family was having dinner and asked me to wait in Robert's study. The study is directly below the dining room, and the old house has thin floors." Emma felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. It was bad enough that David's family had witnessed her public breakdown, but knowing that a complete stranger had overheard the whole humiliating scene made it infinitely worse. "I heard everything," Alexander continued quietly. "Your mother-in-law's cruelty, your husband's cowardice, and that sound when she hit you. I've been in business long enough to witness plenty of ugly behavior, but what I heard that night was beyond anything I'd encountered. So you decided to come here and what? Offer me your pity?" Emma's voice was sharp with defensive anger. Alexander shook his head. "I came here to offer you something much more valuable than pity. I came to offer you justice." Emma stared at him, not sure whether to laugh or cry. "Justice? Against the Thompson family? Do you have any idea how powerful they are? They've already destroyed my job, my credit, probably my entire future. There is no justice against people like that. There is if you know where to look for it." Alexander leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. "Emma, the Thompsons made a critical error when they decided to destroy you. They assumed you were powerless, that you had no one who would stand up for you. They were wrong. I don't understand what you're talking about."
Alexander pulled out his phone and showed Emma a news article from the Chicago Tribune's business section. The headline read, "Kane Industries announces major expansion in Chicago market." Emma glanced at the article, then back at Alexander, pieces of a puzzle beginning to click into place. "Kane Industries, that's you?" And as of this morning, Kane Industries owns controlling interests in 17 companies that do business with Thompson Enterprises, including their biggest client, Morrison Development, and their primary lender, First National Bank of Illinois. Emma's mouth fell open. She'd heard of Kane Industries, of course. Everyone in Chicago had. They were one of the largest private equity firms in the country, with a reputation for aggressive acquisitions and ruthless efficiency. She just hadn't connected the soft-spoken man sitting in her grandmother's kitchen with the corporate powerhouse that regularly made headlines. "You're that Alexander Kane," she said weakly. "I'm that Alexander Kane, and I've spent the last week learning everything there is to know about the Thompson family's business empire. It's impressive on the surface, but it's built on some very shaky foundations that could crumble with the right pressure applied in the right places." Emma felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. But she'd learned to be suspicious of hope, especially when it came from wealthy strangers making dramatic promises. "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions he'd rather not face. When he finally looked up, Emma saw something vulnerable in his expression that hadn't been there before. "Because 12 years ago, I was married to a woman named Claire," he said quietly. "She came from a working-class family in Detroit, and my parents treated her exactly the way the Thompsons have treated you. They made her feel small and worthless and unwelcome every single day of our marriage." Emma felt her heart clench. What happened to her? "She left me, just like you left David." She said she couldn't live in a world where the people who were supposed to love her treated her like an embarrassment. "I was too proud and too stupid to go after her, too convinced that she'd come back when she realized what she was giving up." Alexander's voice grew thick with regret. "She didn't come back. She moved to California, finished her degree, became a teacher, built a good life for herself, the kind of life she deserved. She died 3 years ago in a car accident, and I never got the chance to tell her how sorry I was for not protecting her from my family's cruelty." Emma reached across the table and touched Alexander's hand, understanding flooding through her. "You're not doing this for me at all. You're doing this for her. Maybe. Or maybe I'm doing it because someone needs to prove that people like the Thompsons can't just destroy lives without consequences. Either way, the result is the same. I have the power to make them pay for what they did to you, and I intend to use it." Emma pulled her hand back, her practical nature warring with her desire for revenge. "What exactly are you proposing?" Alexander's smile was sharp as a blade. "The Thompsons have built their empire on reputation and relationships. Old money, old connections, old favors. But business today moves faster than their antiquated network can keep up with. Within 6 months, I can systematically dismantle everything they've built, piece by piece." "That sounds like it would hurt a lot of innocent people too. David's siblings, their employees. Patricia and Jonathan Thompson are adults who chose to participate in their mother's campaign against you. As for the employees, they'll be better off working for companies that don't operate like medieval fiefdoms. I'm not talking about burning everything down out of spite, Emma. I'm talking about surgical precision." Alexander outlined his plan with the calm efficiency of someone who'd clearly spent years perfecting the art of corporate warfare. Thompson Enterprises relied heavily on government contracts that could be challenged by companies with better proposals and cleaner records. Their real estate holdings were leveraged against loans that could be called in by new ownership. Their social connections were with people who valued profit over loyalty when push came to shove. "Within 6 months, Robert Thompson will be lucky to keep his house in Lake Forest," Alexander concluded. "Margaret will have to learn what it's like to live without the power that comes from other people's money, and David will finally understand what it costs to marry a coward." Emma felt a dark satisfaction at the thought of Margaret's empire crumbling, but something held her back. "What do you want from me in return?" "Nothing," Alexander said, and Emma could tell he meant it. "Well, that's not entirely true. I want you to let me give you back what they took away. Your job, your dignity, your future. I want you to let me help you build something better than what you had before. I don't need charity. This isn't charity. This is investment. You're brilliant, Emma. I've read your work, your case studies, your proposals for reforming the juvenile justice system. The Thompsons saw your background as a weakness, but I see it as your greatest strength. You understand what it's like to fight for everything you have." Alexander leaned forward, his intensity palpable. "I'm starting a new foundation focused on criminal justice reform and youth advocacy. I need someone to run it, who actually understands the problems we're trying to solve, not some society matron who treats charity work like a fashion accessory. I need someone with your passion and your expertise." Emma felt tears threatening again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. For the first time in months, someone was seeing her for what she could contribute, rather than what she lacked. "And if I say yes, if I let you do this, then in 6 months you'll be running a foundation with a $100 million endowment. The Thompson family will be facing the consequences of their actions, and you'll never have to worry about people like Margaret Thompson again." Emma looked around her grandmother's kitchen, thinking about the woman who had raised her to believe that everyone deserved dignity and respect regardless of where they came from. Rosa would have told her to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true, but she also would have said that sometimes the universe sends exactly the help you need at exactly the moment you need it. When do we start? Emma asked. Alexander's smile was brilliant. We already have. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.